We're in series on putting on the whole armor of God, and this is session number 5. And I want to thank you for joining me today in this particular session. We've been taking up this whole aspect of putting on the whole armor of God, and I'm sorry that I've labored a little bit. It's just me, because I want you to understand why we have the armor of God. I want you to understand why we are encouraged by Paul the Apostle to wear the armor of God, and the reasons for wearing it. And in order to do that, as I said several times on our series here, that purpose without a discipline will never be achieved. You can have any purpose in life, but if you don't have a discipline to it, it'll never get done. And then you can have a discipline, but if the discipline doesn't have a purpose, after a while it gets monotonous and you stop doing it. So we got to have both. We got to have an understanding or the purpose for which we don this stuff, but we've also equally got to have the discipline to put it on. So I think if we can marry the two of them together, it will be very, very helpful. Now, I have a lot to cover this morning, so let me, if I may, jump into this. We started to talk about the fact that we are born into or in touch with two worlds. God made us in his image and after his likeness, and we are spirit beings. And as spirit beings, I'm connected to that spirit world, and as a physical being in this earth suit, I have access to the physical world in which I live. Unlike the animals that God created and put on the planet, they are physical entities. But you and I, as human beings, you and I, as created in the image and after the likeness of God, we are spirit beings in a physical body. And so we're connected to two worlds. And originally the intent of God was that Adam, as a spiritual being having a physical experience, would, under God's influence, under God's guidance, under God's relationship, govern and rule the earth as an extension of heaven. Remember, Jesus said, pray the prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So God's always wanted to have an extension of heaven here on earth. And he was going to, through man, influence man to govern the earth through man's human spirit and out through his physical body. And so we're connected to both worlds. We talked about one is spiritual, the other is physical, one is supernatural, the other is natural, one's eternal, and the other is temporal. We talked about how that these two worlds coexist side by side. They run parallel together. And as I said, coexist. And I use the analogy here of the Matrix because the Matrix was a good example of it. These two worlds running parallel one to the other, coexisting. We talked about how that in this other spirit world, although you can't see it, doesn't mean it's not there. In fact, it's more real than the physical world, because the physical world will change and pass away, but the eternal world, it's eternal. And in fact, this physical world that we are in came from that arena, came from the spiritual arena. So the spiritual arena is more real in that it's eternal. But in that arena, in this spiritual arena, we read from the scriptures that there's all sorts of entities and creatures out there that exist in that non-visible arena, which exactly coexists around us right now. There are seraphim and cherubim and living creatures. There's an archangel, there's a messenger angel, ministering angels, fallen angels, there's demons, there are devils, there's spirits, there are thrones, there are dominions, principalities, powers, authorities, rulers of the darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places. There's all sorts of entities that are real and phenomenal creatures that are within that realm. Although unseen doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It actually does exist. We talked about how that God, although he owns everything, he gives stewardship of this planet to Adam, to man. It says, you are blessed of the Lord which made heaven and earth. The heaven, even the heavens are the Lord's, but the earth had he given to the children of men. Man was given charge of the earth. The thing about it was, although Adam was given charge, and God will break that rule, God intended to influence Adam, spirit to spirit, and Adam would then govern the earth, rule the earth, replenish the earth, have dominion over the earth under the influence of God. But Adam, unfortunately, he yielded to another entity called Satan. And we took him up a few weeks ago and talked about his position in heaven, his reign before Adam and Eve, and his fall and his demise before Adam and Eve ever showed up on the planet Earth. But when Adam and Eve showed up, this particular entity called Satan, who's a spiritual dignitary, he was next in line to the throne of God in the sense of creation. He was the highest of God's creation as far as angelic host is concerned. Phenomenal creature, beautiful to look at, full of wisdom, and just the most awesome creature you ever saw. And made up of all sorts of diamonds and gold and beryl and onyx and jasper and sapphires, and he's an incredible creature. I can't imagine how beautiful he is. But this particular entity, after his demise, he used to be called Lucifer, but became Satan. After his demise, he usurped his authority into the earth. He was here, obviously, in Genesis chapter 3, in the Garden of Eden, and there was a reason he had been cast down to the earth. But the term here, usurp, means this. Usurp means to take a position of power, of importance, illegally or by force. And when Satan encouraged Adam or influenced Adam to go independent against God by eating the fruit that he was forbidden to eat, that act of independence separated man from God. It didn't separate God from man, but it separated man from God. And in doing so, instead of man being under the influence of God, which was always the intent, he now became under the influence of this fallen entity called Satan. So Satan illegally usurped his authority to take the place of someone in a position of power illegally or to supplant. And so instead of God influencing man's human spirit to dominate and subdue the earth, Adam bowed his knee to this creature, and this creature now became the spiritual influence of man, and that influence is sin. In Romans 6:16, Paul, by the Spirit of God, says, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone to obedient slaves, you are the slaves of the one you obey?" Or basically, if you bow your knee to someone, they become your master. And again, Jesus taught us that whatever happens to the master happens to the servant. And so Satan here, in this instance, Satan became man's master. And as a result, because of his influence upon mankind, he became the god of the social order that we have here. What Adam and Eve went on to produce in dominating, subduing, and replenishing the earth was under the influence of this particular entity called Satan. And so Jesus, or Paul here, when he addresses him, makes this statement here. It says, "But if our gospel be hid, it's hid to them who are lost, in whom the God of this world," and the word there is age, or the age in which we're living in, this system, the God of it is Satan, who has blinded the minds of them who believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ should shine upon them, whose the image of God should shine upon them. And so here we see Paul addressing the reality that the world in which we're living, in the age in which we live, has literally come under the influence of this particular entity. Spiritual influence in physical affairs. We've got to understand that this is the way it works. This is actually what's happening. That there is a spiritual influence upon physical affairs. Adam and Eve were meant to physically carry out the rule of the planet under God's influence. Lost that influence. He's now under the influence of sin. And that distorted man's motive. It distorted man's purpose to a great degree. Man, instead of living for God, started to live for himself. Man, instead of looking to God for approval, started to look to fellow man for approval, and all sorts of things. Bitterness and anger and jealousy and hatred and variance and malice and murder. All of this stuff rose up. It was never intended to happen, but under the influence of sin, that's sort of what got produced. And so we have, and it's all because of spiritual influence that's having an effect in physical affairs. Now, in Ephesians 2, Paul says this, by the Spirit of God, wherein in time past, talking about you and I as believers, before we believed, before we accepted Jesus as our Lord and Savior and entered into his life. It says here in Ephesians 2:2, wherein in time past, talking about before this event in my life or yours, you walked according to the course of this social order. We were motivated, we were yielded, we were chaperoned by the influence, this spiritual influence in physical affairs. We were influenced. Everybody's influenced by it. It says, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. The point he's making here is there is or was a time prior to our salvation where we, like the rest of the people in this age, the rest of the people in this order, were all under the influence of this particular spirit called the power of the earth and the air. Now, here's his influence. Again, this is spiritual influence in physical affairs. The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 4 and verse 8, right after Adam and Eve fell, and ended up put out of the garden. Here we see them, Adam and Eve, with their first two children. It says, and Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass that when they were in a field, it says that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and he slew him. This is the first murder in the scriptures. Obviously, something rose up in Cain, a jealousy, an anger, a hatred, a variance, whatever. I'm not quite sure exactly what it was, but the end result of it was murder. Now that influence didn't come from externally, it came internally, and we know this because the Bible tells us in John the 8th chapter that Jesus said that Satan was a murderer from the beginning. So obviously that influence of this entity had influence upon Cain. And in 1 John later on in the New Testament, as they reflect back on it, listen to what John says. It says, now as Cain, who was that wicked one, and the word there, wicked one, refers to Satan, and refers to was under the influence of the wicked one. Now as Cain, who was that wicked one, and slew his brother, and whereof he slew him, because his own works were evil and his brothers were righteous. Again, making reference to the fact that the influence upon Cain to do what Cain done was Satan. It says over here in Job chapter 1, and Job, you have to remember, is the oldest book in the scriptures. Job was written before Moses ever came along, before there was an Israel out there, before there was an Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to work with God. There was a guy, an individual here called Job, and this book was written before Abraham, but this guy has a relationship with God, and the book reveals some things that are going on, and again, it's this spiritual influence in physical affairs. It says in Job 1:6, now there was a day when the sons of God, these are angels, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, this is this fallen entity, Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, where did you come from? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. I want you to know that that's where he is. This is where he resides. This is where he runs around. And so when he presents himself to God and God says, where have you been? He says, I've been on the earth and I've been walking around all over. And then God goes into this discussion with him where he says, I bet you saw my man Job down there. And then we get into all of this other discourse. But again, I want you to see Satan is going to and fro, walking up and down in the earth. In Daniel, in the 10th chapter, Daniel reaches out to God in prayer to find out what's going to happen to the children of Israel. And in doing so, God releases a messenger angel called Gabriel to come and minister to Daniel and to give Daniel the answer to his prayer. However, as Daniel waits for that answer, it takes 21 days before the answer actually arrives. But when the messenger angel Gabriel arrives, he explains what has happened. And he's going to describe, again, spiritual influence in physical affairs. And so it says here in Daniel 12, and then he said unto me, fear not, Daniel, For from the very first day that you did set your heart to understand or to pray about what the issue was, and to chasten yourself before your God, your words were heard. And I have come because of your prayer. That's why I'm here. Now watch what he says. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia, he's talking here about a principality, not a physical one, a spiritual one. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Now there was a physical nation called Persia, and there was a king of Persia, and there was a reign of that nation physically in the earth. But that physical nation had a spiritual principality that influenced that nation. And so it says here, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, or 21 days. This particular individual, this particular entity, hindered the messenger angel from getting through to Daniel in the heavenlies. It says, but lo, Michael, one of the chief princes. Now he's talking about Michael, who's an archangel. He says Michael had to come. And it says, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. Gabriel couldn't pass through. This entity wouldn't let him pass. Whatever sort of warfare, whatever sort of engagement went on in the heavenly arena, Michael, an archangel, had to come down and assist Gabriel to enable Gabriel to break through that heavenly arena and come into to Daniel and bring that answer to Daniel's prayer. Again, more insight as the angel endeavors to leave. He makes another comment. It says here in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 20, and then he said, know thou wherefore I am come unto thee, or you now know why I came, and now will I return to fight with the prince of Persia. Not the physical prince, the spiritual principality. And when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. When you look at world history, after the dominance of the nation of Persia in the earth, the next empire that arose after Persia was Greece, the Grecian Empire. And here he gives insight. He says, I'm going up to fight with the prince of Persia, and you know what? There's another principality coming to the fore, that's coming to the front and center, and it's the principality over Greece. But I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is none that holdeth with me in these things but Michael, your principality. He was the principality that fought for the nation of Israel. Again, all I'm trying to get you to see is that there's a lot of times we see physical outworkings here on the earth, whether that be national rise or national demise. And we sometimes think, well, it's all down to politics and it's all down to this and all down to that in this physical arena. The reality of most of this is that it's not. There is a spiritual influence that is bearing an effect in the physical affairs of men. And although it's unseen, it's very real. And although it's unseen, it's very much active in the affairs of humanity. Here's an angelic influence over in the book of Joshua. Joshua is about to go into Jericho and fight that battle at Jericho. They just come out of the wilderness. They just come into the land of Canaan. And as he's out seeking the face of God concerning the battle that's ahead of him, the problem that's ahead of him, because this was a huge city with huge walls and it was built by giants. And so it says, and it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, art thou for us or for our adversaries? Joshua is looking around the walls of Jericho. He is surveying the battle scene. And as he's looking, he sees this particular entity with a sword drawn, and he automatically, being the soldier that he is, approaches him and says, are you with me or against me? And he said, nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord I am come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, what saith my Lord unto his servant? Well, the person he saw here was the captain of the host, the captain of God's angelic army. And that's the Lord, the second member of the Godhead, but nonetheless he understood who it was. And the manifestation of the captain of the host caused this man Joshua to fall face down and worship. And the captain of the Lord's host said unto me, Joshua, loose thy shoes from off your foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. That's how we know that this was a member of the Godhead, because it was holy ground. And again, here we have Joshua about to engage in a physical encounter, and I want you to see that there is a spiritual influence in physical affairs. Here's another one. This is a guy called Sennacherib. He's a king, and Sennacherib is an Assyrian king, and he's about to invade Israel and take the city of Jerusalem. So the city of Jerusalem is under siege, and he sends some letters and some people to speak to those who are hanging over the wall watching it, and Sennacherib sends up a messenger, and he says what he's going to do if they don't open the gates and let him in. And so Isaiah the prophet and Hezekiah seek God, and God intervenes on their behalf. We have this spiritual influence in physical affairs. It says here, and for this cause Hezekiah the king and the prophet Isaiah the son of Amoz prayed, and they cried to heaven. And the Lord sent an angel. Here's this spiritual influence in physical affairs. The Lord sent an angel which cut off all of the mighty men of valor, and the leaders of the captains in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned with shame face to his own land. And when he was come into his own house, or into the house of his God, it says that there came of his own bowels, or one of his own kids, and slew him. This is the king of Assyria, there with the sword. And the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, and from the hand of all other, and guided them on every side. So here we see God being invoked by the king and by the prophet because of the immediate physical threat. And God sends an angel, this spiritual influence that now brings to bear an answer in physical affairs. In Kings, it actually says it a little bit better. It sort of magnifies in a bit more detail what actually happened in this particular event. So let me go over here to the book of Kings. In 2 Kings, here's what it says. It says the same incident, but a little bit more detail. It says, therefore thus said the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, because he was threatening to, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with a shield, nor cast a bank or a ladder up against the wall. He says, but the way that he came, and by the same he shall return, and shall not come into the city, saith the Lord. For I will defend the city, to save it. It says, for my own sake, and for my servant David's sake. God said, I'll get involved here. I'll bring spiritual influence to bear in physical affairs. Now here's what he did. Remember, he sent the angel? And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote the camp of the Assyrians, 180,500. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. 185,000 soldiers. This one angel, he said, God sent an angel, and this angel came and slew 185,000 men that night. Spiritual influence into physical affairs. It happens. It happens all the time. Here's another one. This is over in the book of 2 Kings in chapter 6. This is a guy called Elisha. He's a prophet. And being a prophet, he has insight into things that are going to happen in the future. And the king of Syria comes out against the children of Israel, but every time he tries to set up an ambush for the army of Israel, every time he sets up an elaborate ambush, he finds out that Israel never show up. And he's a bit discontented over the whole thing. And he pulls in all his generals and he talks to his generals and he says, what's the deal here? Every time we are told where they're going to be or where they're going to come through, we set up an ambush and we spend a lot of time preparing and waiting for them to come so we can ambush them. And every time it seems like they know not to go there. So what's the deal? Have we got a spy in the camp? And one of his generals says, well, King, it's not us. And there is a prophet down the street in Israel, and his name is Elisha. And being a prophet, he knows everything. He even knows what's going on in your own bedchamber. So the king says, okay, well then here's what we need to do. We need to get the prophet. If we can get rid of the prophet, then we can deal with Israel. Now, why he thought, if Elijah didn't already know every ambush that was going to be set up against Israel, how he wouldn't know that the king was going to come after him. But the king sent a huge host of his army down to Dothan, the city where Elisha and his servant were sleeping that night. And so here's what happened. It says, therefore he sent thither horses and chariots and a great host. And they came by night and they surrounded the city. Now in the city is Elisha and his servant Gehazi. It says, and when the servant, this is Gehazi, the man of God, was risen early and gone forth, behold, a host surrounded the city, both with horses and chariots. And his servant said unto him, alas, my master, how shall we do? I mean, as the sun rises, Gehazi, the servant of the prophet, sort of steps out onto the balcony of the motel, looks over and he sees that there's this massive army of the Syrians surrounding the whole city. And he panics. What are we going to do? My goodness, we're done. They're obviously here for Elisha, and he runs into the master and says, what are we going to do? We're in big trouble. And he answered, this is the answer that Elisha gave him, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. I mean, what a statement. As you look out, you see the army of Syria all over the shop, all over the place. And he turns around and says, now don't worry about it. Don't be afraid. There's more with us than there are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. Obviously, Elisha could see something that Gehazi couldn't see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. Boy, that must have been some sight. Obviously they were there, but Elisha knew they were there, but his Gehazi, his servant, couldn't see him. And so he asked, he said, Lord, let him see. Open his eyes and let him see what is really going on out there. And so he gets this vision of these chariots of fire and these horses and chariots of fire that totally surround the Syrian army. Again, spiritual influence in physical affairs. The spiritual activity in the unseen realm, it brings influence to bear in the natural realm. And it's something we've got to understand. Now, when we get into this sort of an arena and we start to talk about stuff, unfortunately, and it is unfortunate, Christians many times take this thing to an extreme and they get weird sometimes or flaky and bizarre. And we don't need to be. There's perfect balance to all of this. We have to be aware of that world that coexists with us. We have to be aware of the entities that exist there and the influence that they bring to bear in the physical world in which we live. When we do that and understand that, we can then better or properly engage that arena. And we engage that arena for a particular reason. Not to be spooky or weird or bizarre or finding devils and demons under every coffee table and in every opposition or in every situation, because that's not the way it works and that's not truly what is happening. However, there is spiritual influence in physical affairs, and we need to know how to discern and understand when it happens and what to do when we discover it happens. So, again, spiritual activity in the unseen realm bringing influence to bear in the natural realm. We have to be aware of this because this is the arena or this is the reason, excuse me, for putting on the whole armor of God. That's the reason that we have it, to deal with this, to engage this influence ourselves. So, revelation is progressive. I have to put this down here just to remind myself to explain this to you. Revelation is progressive. As you go through the Bible, we learn more and more and more and more and more about God. And remember this, that the scriptures that we have are not a revelation of history. They're not a revelation of science, although it's scientifically accurate. It's not a revelation of astronomy, although astrologically it is accurate. It's not a book of science, although it's scientifically accurate. And it's not, as I said, a book of history to give us the history of the Jews and whatever, although it's historically and architecturally accurate. The Bible is a revelation of God. God gave it to us. God breathed it to give us the information that we would need to know so that we could get to understand Him and what's going on around us and why we ended up the way we were and why He brought His influence to bear by becoming a man and dealing with this whole issue. And so the people in the Old Testament, they didn't really understand spiritual things. They weren't aware of it. They were aware that it had happened. They were aware that there was entities and gods and an influence from outside. That's why all the pagans, looked to the god of the harvest and the god of weather, because they understood that there was some type of spiritual influence in physical affairs, but they didn't understand fully what it was. When Jesus came along, Jesus totally unveiled all that was going on, totally revealed what was happening in that arena. And then Paul, of course, later on, because of the revelation that was given him, expounded it even more. So the scriptures, particularly in the New Testament, open all of this to us. But Jesus came along and Jesus revealed the spirit world to us. When he went in Luke 16 and talked about the rich man and Lazarus going down into the underworld and so on and so forth, into Abraham's bosom, and this was all revelatory. Nobody understood really what was happening after death, but Jesus started to unpack it and reveal it to us. So Jesus is very aware of this matrix, this coexisting of spiritual and physical worlds and the spiritual influence in physical affairs. In Luke chapter 4 and verse 5, it says, "And the devil," this is Satan, "take him up into a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms in the world in a moment of time. And the devil said unto him, All this power will I give you, and the glory of them, for that is delivered unto me to whomsoever I want to give it. And if you will therefore worship me, all shall be thine. And then Jesus answered and said unto him," because he knows exactly who he is, he understands exactly what's going on, "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus was very aware of spiritual influence in physical affairs. He said this many times, and here's three of them. It says in John 12:31, again, Jesus is addressing the spiritual matrix. The disciples around didn't fully understand what was going on. "Now the judgment of this cosmos," or this order, says, "Now is the judgment of this social order. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out." Again, he was aware that there was a principality that was running the show, influencing the show. It says, "Hereafter I will not talk much with you, for the prince of this world cometh and hath nothing in me." Again, Jesus was very aware that there was a principality that was influencing this social order, this spiritual influence interfering or involving itself in the affairs of men. He says in John 16, "Of judgment, because the principality of this social order is judged." Jesus was very aware of it, and he carried out his ministry, again, aware of where the influence was coming from upon mankind. In Matthew chapter 12, it says, "And when the Pharisees heard it, they said, This fellow doth cast out devils." Jesus was delivering people. Now, people never saw deliverance before. In the Old Testament, many times you'll see that God, when he gave the army an instruction to go in and destroy a nation, an opposing nation, sometimes, not all the time, sometimes God would say, like he did with Jericho, go in and destroy everything, kill all things, men, women, children, animals, beasts, the lot, kill, leave nothing alive. A lot of times we say, well, that's so cruel. Why would God do such a thing? But again, because they didn't understand spiritual things, demon possession and all sorts of perverseness came about because of spiritual influence in physical affairs. And man wasn't and didn't have the ability nor the understanding to set themselves free from what was going on, because they didn't really understand what was going on. And so until such time as Jesus showed up, most of these people knew that there was an influence, but they couldn't put their thumb on it, couldn't identify it, but Jesus exposes it. So when Jesus came along and started to cast out devils, they were shocked, because normally they didn't cast them out. Normally the only casting out they did was to cast them out from their midst, or throw them out of the city, or tie them in chains and put them somewhere where nobody could see them, because these were crazy people, demon possessed. And so they'd bind them with chains or whatever. And these guys, whoever they were demon possessed, had supernatural strength, and they were wild and weird and fearful, and had supernatural strength, and so on and so forth. So everybody was afraid of them. But Jesus came along and he starts delivering people from these devils. So the Pharisees, because they can't work it all out, because they don't fully understand at this juncture, they start to say, well, he's obviously, if he's casting out devils, he obviously must be the prince of devils himself, because he has authority over them. So it says, but when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow that cast out devils by Beelzebub, the prince of the devils. Jesus knew their thoughts and said unto them, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to destruction or desolation. Every city or a house divided against itself just doesn't have the ability to stand. If Satan, now here's the revelation, if Satan cast out Satan, he is divided against himself, how shall then his kingdom stand? And again, Jesus revealed something, that Satan, this spiritual entity, this spiritual dignitary, this fallen angel, fallen cherub, has influence in the cosmos, in the social order, and he has a kingdom. Now, he offered Jesus all the kingdoms of this world when he was asking Jesus to bow down and worship him, but he also has a kingdom in the spiritual or in the heavenly arenas. And if Beelzebub cast out devils, by whom do your children cast them out? Therefore, they shall be your judges. But if I cast out devils by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God is come unto you. So if ever a spirit did ever leave by an incantation or a prayer of deliverance, and it ever left, they didn't know why it left, they didn't know what it was, and they couldn't necessarily intentionally replicate it. Jesus could, because he knew exactly what was going on. In Mark, the 4th chapter, he's talking about the sower sowing the seed and talking about the parable of the ground. And he makes this statement again, bringing the disciples into this awareness of this spiritual influence in physical affairs. The sower sowed the word, and these are they by the wayside where the word was sown, and when they heard, and now he explains, Satan comes immediately and takes away the word that was sown in their hearts. Or as Paul said, as we read earlier in the book of Corinthians, if our gospel be hid, it's hid to them that are lost, in whom the God of this world blinds the minds of them. Same principle. And again, Jesus is bringing light to bear on the reality that there is an influence spiritually on physical affairs. He will come and steal the word. Every time you hear it, he'll try and steal it from you. In Luke 10 and verse 17, it says, and the 70 returned. Here are his disciples that he sent out 2 by 2 to preach the kingdom of God is at hand. It says, and the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through your name. And he said unto them, and now he makes a reference. He's talking about devils, talking about these people that were possessed or being controlled or highly influenced by spiritual entity. And then he says, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. Behold, I give you power to tread upon the serpents and scorpions, and over all the power, watch, he has power, all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Notwithstanding, in this rejoice, not that the spirits are subject unto you. So he calls these devils or these demons spirits. This is spiritual influence in physical affairs. But rather rejoice that your names are written in heaven. Here's another one. In Luke chapter 13. And this is just looking at the bigger picture. And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. This was on a Saturday. And behold, there came a woman who had a spirit of infirmity 18 years. And she'd been bowed over together and could no wise lift herself up. So she was twisted. And the Lord said unto her, and called her to him, and said unto the woman, when the Lord saw her, he called her unto him and said to the woman, Woman, thou art loosed from your infirmity. And he laid his hand on her, and immediately she was made straight, and she glorified God. I mean, he dealt with it immediately. I mean, she just came in, she was twisted, had been for 18 years. Now, the people aren't going to be happy because he's healing on the Sabbath. So he gets into this immediate pushback from the religious. And when the rulers of the synagogue, answered with him, I'm so sorry. Anyway, and the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them thereof come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. In other words, the 6 days to do this, but not on the Sabbath day. And the Lord answered him and said, Thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox and ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? In other words, he says, it's amazing, you have all these rules and regulations on the Sabbath, but you know what? You know your animals need a drink, you know your animals need to eat, and it's amazing that you've made rules against humanity, against people. We can't do anything for people, but we can take the ox and the ass out and give them a drink of water and something to eat on a Sabbath day. He says, and ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan had bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? So obviously this woman had been, her infirmity was influenced or came about by spiritual influence. Now, let me say this before I move on here. Not every ailment, not every sickness, not every disease is demonic. A lot of people will jump on this. As I said, people go spooky and bizarre and weird, and they take it out of balance and out of line with truth. Some are, and most aren't. Most are our diet, most are not looking after our physiology correctly and properly, and therefore we lower our immune systems and all the wonderful things that God gave us to keep us healthy and well. Although sickness didn't come from God, and sickness has its origin in sin, but not every sickness is so to speak, demonically influenced. Although sin is the cause for our ill health and so on and so forth, but nonetheless, this woman was particularly constrained and bent over because of demonic influence, and so he released her from it. And you say, well, do I run around casting the devil out of everybody who's sick? Absolutely not. I always say and said through the years, when we've had any encounter in this arena, if you'll notice, when Jesus went to minister the kingdom, went to minister from town to town, city to city, he never went looking for devils, demons, and so on and so forth. But if they ever showed up, he dealt with them. But he didn't go around looking for them. So please understand the balance of it. We'll get into it later on. It says here in Mark chapter 1, verse 23, and there were in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, Jesus of Nazareth? Are you come to destroy us? I know that you are who you are. You're the Holy One of God. This was a demon-possessed individual. Jesus rebuked him, saying, Hold your peace, and come out of him. And when the unclean spirit had torn him, thrown him around the place, and cried with a loud voice, he came out. And they were all amazed, insomuch that they questioned among themselves, saying, What thing is this? And what doctrine is this? And what authority commanded he, even the unclean spirit, that they obey him? I mean, they were amazed. They were amazed at what he was doing. Jesus was very aware of spiritual influence in human affairs. When it arose, as I said, he didn't go looking for this, but when it presented itself, he dealt with it. If it wasn't demonically infused, demonically engaged, he would just deal with healing in the normal sense of praying for and healing the sick. But when demonic activity in this level showed up, where the influence was more than just an influence, but it was an actual possession, and it takes a long time to get there, by the way. So don't think for 1 minute that spirits jump on you, and anyway, we'll talk about it later when we get into the series. I'm just laying the groundwork for balance here. In Mark chapter 5, it says, when they saw Jesus, Jesus goes across a lake to a place called Gadara. And when he arrives on the shores of Gadara, there is an entity here that has possessed a man. And the people were afraid of this man, so they ousted him to the wilderness, and he sort of hung around the graveyard, and he was naked, and he had been bound with fetters and chains, but in his supernatural strength he broke them off, so people avoided the area. But Jesus happened to be pulling up from the lake, and he pulls up in Gadara, and this demoniac approaches Jesus. And I'm sure the disciples were wondering, my goodness, what's going to happen here? What's going to happen now? Because here's this guy coming rushing to Jesus. It says, but when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and he worshipped him, and cried out with a loud voice and said, what have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that you torment me not. Now, this last one was in Mark chapter 1. This is in Mark chapter 5. So this is not the same thing. This is another one. And then he said, in verse 8, and he said unto him, come out of him, or come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. And he asked, what is your name? And he answered, saying, my name is Legion, for we are many. Legion? A legion is 6,000. In a Roman legion, there was 6,000 soldiers. When Jesus said, I can call 12 legions of angels, he was talking about, I can call 72,000 angels at this moment if I need to. But here, this man was possessed with 6,000 devils, demons. And again, this was one individual. And again, this was spiritual influence in physical affairs, because they do. It's a real reality. It's an ongoing reality. In Mark again, chapter 9, and straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. This is a man who brings his son to Jesus, because his disciples are unsuccessful in casting this particular devil out of this particular boy. You say, well, what was the outworking of this devil's influence? Well, it kept causing the child to try and commit suicide or throw himself into the fire. And so Jesus had to deal with it. And as the crowd were coming, Jesus realizes that I'm going to get an audience here, so I better do this quick. And it says, and when Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit and said unto him, thou dumb and deaf spirit. That was the other outworking physically of this particular spiritual involvement. I charge thee, come out of him and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried and rent him sore and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. Again, not everybody deaf is it's not a demonic thing. Not everybody dumb is a demonic thing. Don't think that, please. As I said, when these things manifest, when these things show up, then we deal with them, but we don't go looking for them. That's not what we do. It also says here, let me read this, in Mark 12:43. And the unclean spirit, Jesus is teaching a concept here, as I said, it's revelatory, progressive. Revelation is progressive. Jesus is now teaching a principle. When an unclean spirit is gone out of a man, he walketh through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he said, this is the devil, I will return into my house from whence I came. And when he is come, he findeth it empty, swept, and garnished. Or the man, the house he possessed, the individual he possessed, has been delivered. Then goeth he and taketh with himself 7 other spirits, more wicked than himself, and they enter in and dwell there, and the last state of that man is worse than the first. Even so shall it be also unto this wicked generation. Principle. You certainly, when people are open to these things and they do take possession, and this spiritual influence has that sort of physical force and power over a person's life, he said, when you deliver that person, you want to make sure you put something else in there. And so it's not a matter of running around just delivering people. Any time Jesus delivered people, they came to believe on him, and they took on a whole new demeanor and a whole new purpose in life. But this running around just casting them out for casting them out's sake is not what we do. This is not what it's about. In Matthew chapter 8, and when even was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils, and he cast out the spirits with his word. That was one thing, and then healed all that were sick. I mean, he was doing 2 things. Not everybody that was sick was demonically spawned, but he was dealing with both, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, himself took our infirmities and bare our sicknesses. In Luke chapter 23, and when they had come to the place which was called Calvary, there they crucified him with the malefactors, one on the right side and one on the left. Now watch what he says. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, because they don't know what's really going on. Powerful words. He understood that it wasn't the Pharisees, and it wasn't the Sadducees, and it wasn't the Romans, it wasn't the Gentiles. He understood that there was a spiritual battle going on, a heavenly battle, engagement going on, and that these people were doing what they were doing because of the influence that was over them. And Jesus loved the people. He understood what was happening. He understood why man had gone the way he had gone. And yet he created man in his image and after his likeness, and he fully understood the potential that was in every man. And he looked at them and thought, you know what, you don't really understand what you're doing. You have no idea what's really going on. Father, forgive them. They just don't understand yet what's happening. In Luke 6:27, he said out, and Jesus, he says, I say unto you, which hear, love your enemies. Do good to them which hate you. Later on he says, love your enemies. Do good to them and lend, hoping for nothing. Why would you say love your enemies? Because Jesus understands that when we see, and if we saw the bigger picture, we'd realize that really what's coming against us many times, or what's influencing people against us, is a spiritual influence in the physical affairs. And many times we pick on the people, we pick on the individual, we despise or hate or are angry with certain individuals because what we see is them, we see the individual. And as Jesus said when he was being nailed to that cross, Father, forgive them, they have no idea why they do what they do, the influence that they are under, the matrix of worlds that are going on here, the conflict that goes on between both. He said they have no idea. And so Jesus was able to look at the people, and when he was teaching his doctrine, he was saying, you know what? And again, he's speaking from his elevated revelation of what's going on. He says, you know what? You need to love your enemies. And they're going, what? I hate my enemies. He goes, if you really understood what was going on, if you really understood why they do what they do, why they yield in the manner in which they do in life, he said, you'd understand. They're just puppets of a puppeteer. And I really want you to love one another. But if you understood what was going on, you'd look beyond your enemy and say, I understand. And then you would love your enemies. And he refers to it. They thought he was weird for saying this, but it's not, because he fully understood what was going on. It says here, he that committed sin is of the devil, for the devil sinned from the beginning. But watch. But for this purpose, the Son of God was manifest, that he might destroy this influence in physical affairs. He said that's what he came to. He came to destroy sin and this influence, spiritual influence in physical affairs, in human affairs. And we're going to get to this then. This is where we're going. So, it says, Paul said, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood. You got to see the bigger picture. You got to understand what's going on. You got to understand what's happening in this matrix of coexisting spiritual and physical worlds. The entities that are involved, the purposes involved, and the manner in which they get involved to bring to bear influence in physical affairs. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Well, we'll have another look at it next week. I hope this helped you to understand that there really, really is this meshing of two worlds. And Jesus, when we talk about Jesus' ministry and his love and loving people and being good and kind and no sin in him, and you think, this is our takeaway from the gospel. Well, let me tell you, most of what Jesus was doing and talking about was this influence, this spiritual influence in physical affairs, human affairs. And I tried to read those scriptures to show you that it's always been that way. From the fall of Adam, this entity, this spiritual entity, this dignitary, Satan, and his kingdom has brought influence to bear in the physical human world in which we live. And people turn around and say, well, why does this happen? Why doesn't God do this? And why doesn't God do that? Well, God is trying to influence the world. And he has to do it through man. And he endeavors to do it through you and me. But we've got to fully understand what's going on like Jesus did. And we've got to engage it and encounter it in a proper stance with a proper understanding. And we got to get in there and bring the right influence to bear in the generation in which we live. That's where we're going. And as we press into this, I hope that it becomes revelatory and inspirational, so that we would, with the purpose of knowing to put on the whole armor of God, that we would take up the discipline of making sure that we do, and that we would make a difference in our generation because of it. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you, Lord God, for the word this morning, what we talked about, what we're reading about. I pray, God, that you would help us to grasp just the depth of the interconnection between both worlds and our purpose in it, now that we are born again of the Spirit of God, and now that we have the revelation of what's going on. I pray, God, you would give us a fuller understanding and the balance then to engage it correctly, and to, through your bidding and by your influence, bring change to bear in the physical world in which we live in, by engaging and dealing with the spiritual influences that cause it. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you for being with me this morning.